So as you might have gathered from the chairman's remarks, environmental justice is a predominant issue right at the forefront for the commission in a number of ways, and we're really glad we have a panel here. I'm going to turn it over to Daniel Moore, who will go ahead and introduce himself and the panelists and start off our discussion. So, Daniel, take it away.
All right. Yeah. Well, thanks, Larry, for having me down here. I cover energy policy for BloombergLaw in DC, and so transmission is top of mind. It's probably what I cover more than anything else at the moment, grid policy and transmission, and so focus on Energy Department and FERC news, and so transmission, environmental justice, really top of mind, so appreciate you having me down. Introducing the panelists here, we're talking about environmental justice. It's something the acting chairman just talked a lot about, so it's a good transition into it. To my left, we have Conrad Bolston. He is the Senior Counsel of Environmental Justice and Equity at FERC. Just started 2 months ago, or something like that, a month ago? March. And he serves as the chairman's primary advisor to help further the goals of the Equity Action Plan at the Commission. To his left, we have Tiffany Ganthier. She is the Director of Government Issues for Ness, Feldman in Washington, and she connects clients on policy matters, helps them write comment letters, and works in the policy arena. And to her left, we have YaVonda Ulfig. She's the Energy Transition and Sustainability Manager for American Electric Power, where she leads the company's efforts to advance environmental justice and social justice issues. So very diverse panel, really excited to dive right in. And I'd like to start by asking if you could all kind of talk more about the work that you do right now as it relates to environmental justice. And I think it'd be helpful if you all kind of defined environmental justice. It's a term that's been around for quite some time. It's gotten a lot of attention on the federal level right now. So tell me a little bit about kind of how you define environmental justice and how it fits into your work. And maybe we can start with you.
Sure,
Conrad.
sure. So as Daniel said, I'm the Senior Counsel for Environmental Justice at Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. I joined in March, right before the Environmental Justice Roundtable, which, as you can imagine, is a very relaxing and not at all. Before I get going, I have to say, everything I talk about today are my own personal opinions. They are not the opinions of the Commission. I'm new to government, so my staff is drilling in this. But broadly, my role, as Daniel said, is to serve as the primary advisor for the chairman and the commission on environmental justice issues, and to help assist the commission in ensuring that its policies and practices are consistent with EJ and equity principles. What that means on a day-to-day is I sit within the Office of General Counsel. I lead a team of attorney advisors to do things like implement the Equity Action Plan and other efforts to review policy on a general level and on a project-by-project basis, and to do stakeholder outreach. So that's kind of the nuts and bolts of who I am and what my position is. Coming from private practice, where I was a counsel in the Environment and Natural Resources Group, doing environmental litigation and enforcement, project development, ESG work, and environmental justice work. So I have a background in environmental justice. I would say, broadly on environmental justice, and I'm going to, because there's a new executive order, I think it's helpful for me to read this out. So bear with me. Because, show of hands, who's read the new executive order on environmental justice? Well, this will be the definition has slightly changed. In the recent executive order, the White House defined environmental justice as the just and meaningful involvement of all people regardless of income, race, color, national origin, tribal affiliation, or disability in agency decision-making and other federal activities that affect human health and the environment, so that people are fully protected from disproportionate and adverse human health and environmental impacts, including risks, hazards, including those related to climate change, the cumulative impact impacts of environmental or other burdens, the legacy of racism or other structures or systemic barriers, and have equitable access to a healthy, sustainable, and resilient environment in which to live, play, work, grow, learn, worship, and engage in cultural subsistence practices. So that's the full definition from that order. I think it is 3 times the size of EPA's current definition. And it kind of lends itself to where the direction of environmental justice is headed and its importance. And I think that environmental justice is going to be an important issue. It's an important issue now, obviously. It's going to be an important issue going forward. From the top-down level, President Biden has named environmental justice as one of his key priorities from the campaign trail all the way to today. There have been several orders, executive orders. The chairman, as you just heard, has identified environmental justice as one of his key priorities. And in addition, this is something that's central to some of the most important questions of how to regulate relates to environmental and energy policy in the 21st century. It's related to cutting-edge science. There are questions about how do you account for burdens and impacts on environmental justice communities that have suffered a disproportionate amount of cumulative and direct impacts. How do you meaningfully engage them? How do you lift their voices? I mean, these are key issues going forward. And every day there's new science. Every month there's a new mapping tool from the federal agencies. Every month there's a new study. The executive order also identified a strategy going forward to assess and identify gaps in science related to cumulative impacts. So the science is developing, the policy is developing, there's new laws, and this is something that's important at the commission, it's important across government, and I think the commission is improving on these issues, and I hope in my role to help the commission further improve. And I think I'll end it there.
Conrad, I've been told your receiver is turned off.
Well, it's good. I'm hoping I'm talking
Repeat
loudly.
everything. Can you read the order again?
How you're better if it's turned back on. So.
How about now?
Nope. Hello?
Yeah.
Hey, here we go. So no one heard what I said. It was a fantastic speech.
Tiffany, how about you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Tiffany Ganthier. I've been with Ness Feldman, a law firm in DC, for about 2.5 years. We are a niche law firm. We work specifically in the energy, environmental, climate change, transportation space. We're working on governmental, regulatory, and compliance issues all within that space. I thought I was running away from the law by joining the public policy group, recovering an attorney, but I apparently did not do so well at running away because they took my environmental justice expertise and dragged me into all of the legal issues with that. So I've worked with the public policy group on mostly policy issues in this space, but I also float around the law firm and work on environmental justice issues, and that's where the comments and advisory issues come in there. I would say that specifically my definition of EJ is that of the EPA. Granted, the reason why my definition is the one used by the EPA is because when I think that the federal government should be aligned on a definition, and right now we're seeing so many definitions kind of coming from different agencies, and I'm hoping, they're all amazing, and the definition that you just read is probably the best. But I'm turning back to EPA because of their tools that accompany that definition. That environmental justice screening tool, of course, is CEQ's tool, so that would match the White House definition. But the environmental justice 2.0 tool that EPA released is what we're using to analyze communities as far as our projects go. So it's a tough place to say what the definition is because everyone kind of has their own definition, but me personally, I align with EPA because they have the accompanying tool. Granted, CEQ's tool, as it gets updated, whichever tool basically will address cumulative impacts is the tool that I'm going with. So until that happens, we'll see, then that's, we're here with environmental justice screening tool. Ultimately, for me, I think environmental justice comes down to the simple formula of course, not discriminating based on race, national origin, low income, color, all the things, but also meaningful public engagement. And also, additionally, there needs to be some sort of accountability implemented into that. I think there's been a lot of checkbox. I talked to the community, and then, I did what I wanted to do. So if there's no accountability played into these definitions, then I don't see there actually being a change in these environmental justice issues, which is why I think DOE is doing such a great job with their community benefits plan and hinging all the money on you actually completing this plan and following through with it. So I hope to see more of that accountability built into all of the programs and initiatives that are coming forth. And I think that would help actually see some change in this space. I'm supposed to talk for 5 minutes on this introduction.
You don't
So,
have to
okay.
talk. You don't want to. We can, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right, so I am YaVonda Ulfig. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. So I've been with the company almost 14 years, and so I'm currently part of our corporate sustainability group. Just stepped into that role in February and had a number of communications, outreach, and HR roles prior to that. So as Daniel mentioned, I'm the manager of energy transition and sustainability, which means a couple of things. So I lead our efforts around ESJ, but I also lead our efforts around just transition, which ties into ESJ as well. And so he asked for our definition of ESJ. Really, from a company standpoint, we look at ESJ this way. It's really all about making sure that in all of our activities, whether we're building a transmission line or a distribution substation, for example, or decommissioning a coal plant or another facility, or even when we're operating in the community, through philanthropy, through deployment of customer services and programs and technologies, we want to be, first of all, involving the community in those decision-making processes. So that's number one. And then we also want to be thinking about what are those environmental and social impacts of our recommendations and decisions, and especially those impacts to low-wealth communities and communities of color and other historically disadvantaged communities. And so oftentimes when I think about ESJ, I think about it in terms of 3 key pillars. And sometimes I refer to that as 3 legs of a stool, okay, is the metaphor I like to use. And so that first big piece is understanding what are the demographics, right, of the community that we're impacting through a project or a program, a service, or an activity. That second component comes down to meaningful involvement. How are we engaging with those communities in a way that's meaningful and making sure, as we've talked about this morning, that they have a voice at the table, they have a seat at the table as we're making decisions. And then that last piece comes down to impacts, both positive and negative. So how can we maximize benefits, maximize positive impacts, while also mitigating those disproportionate negative impacts to disadvantaged communities? So from a holistic standpoint, that's really how we define EJ. And I always say ESJ touches so many different parts of the business, customers, employees. I think about the fact that we have 5.6 million customers in 11 states. We have more than 16,000 employees, and ESJ touches so many of them. And that really lies at the heart of the work that I'm doing right now in this space. So long story short, we actually launched an ESJ policy a little over a year ago, so in January of last year. And we wanted to make sure this policy was broad and flexible enough to apply across the enterprise. And I can talk a little bit more about that policy creation process later. But it was really critical to have something across the board, right, that we can really embed into our practices, processes, and paradigm. And so we created that policy, we launched it. Since then, I've been in the process of socializing that through roadshows with employees. So I did about 30 presentations to employees last year. I'm continuing those presentations this year. And now we're actually embarking on what I really consider to be the watershed moment of our journey. That's where the rubber meets the road, right? So how do we take that policy and really operationalize it? So I'm working on a framework to do that now, to embed it into the 3 Ps I just shared earlier, our practices, processes, and paradigms. So it's a very exciting time to be on the journey. And one other thing I'll mention is, we call our effort ESJ for a reason. I think a lot of times people fixate on the E, and they don't necessarily think about the S piece, right? So affordability, accessibility, reliability, resilience, even philanthropy and economic benefits. And so we like to use that phrase just to make sure that S piece, that social piece, is front and center and top of mind along with the E as people are thinking about this effort. So just some foundational information for you, but very, very excited about this work.
Great. That was all really informative, hearing about the community benefits plans and the demographics and kind of the things you actually take into consideration when you're a project developer, right? And I was kind of want to dive into transmission development and transmission projects specifically, because these things can be challenging if they run long distances. They can run, overhead past communities that may not always see or may not see any tangible benefit from having that line there, right? I know I've talked to communities. I was just in the Southwest talking to folks about the Sunzia transmission line that may finally get approved after 17 years of planning. And so for big lines or even shorter lines, how do you think about community benefits? And Tiffany, maybe you can talk a little bit more about the community benefits plans and agreements that could actually, are there creative ways to communicate with local communities and do that engagement around a transmission line when they're not maybe on one side of it or the other side of it?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, it's valuing their opinions, even if, it may not sound, factually sound to you. This is their lived experiences, and if they feel as though a transmission line coming through their community is going to impact them as far as their housing cost or their ability to, connect with their neighbors and things, and, that's their lived truth. So acknowledging that, we understand that, you will have an impact that you're concerned about, hearing from them on what those concerns might be, hearing from them on what the community would need otherwise, maybe being creative about the co-benefits of your project. I know a lot of people, as far as project developers, are saying, we've talked to the community and what they want, we can't provide, or it has nothing to do with the project. But getting creative about co-benefits is actually super helpful when it comes to these community benefits plans that I'm seeing as far as companies putting forth. We talk to the community and, they actually just want jobs. And sometimes the construction is not actually happening right here for very long, so the job isn't sustainable. Well, we also provided scholarships to 10 students who are from this community to go study engineering or go study energy law or whatever that might be, and that's still a benefit to the community. There are other things that you could do to ease the community into understanding the project and the needs of the project. Although, of course, we know it. We're in this industry. We understand that this is important for getting, the whole entire country aligned as far as receiving and transporting electricity. But they're not going to see that. They're going to see exactly what's right in front of them and what they need. So make sure you're listening to them. And if you don't have that jurisdiction over what they're asking for, help them get there. Connect them to the local government agency that can provide the job training that they need, or connect them to the community college that can provide the classes that they might need. It's about being creative, one, and two, listening to exactly what those needs are. It may or may not have anything to do with your project, but it can be done and it can pacify any other conflict that might come up in regards to your project.
YaVonda, can you talk a little bit about the progress you've made at AEP so far, and maybe some of the biggest questions and goals you have going forward?
Absolutely. And so again, it's a very exciting time to be on the journey. And I do want to start by saying, for us, ESJ is not a new concept, right? I often tell employees during the roadshow I've been doing is, in many ways, we've been doing ESJ for years. We just didn't always call it ESJ. And I think specifically about our transmission organization, and they have a very robust stakeholder engagement and outreach effort and process. And I can talk a little bit more about some of the tools they use, but everything from virtual open houses to in-person open houses, mailings, you name it, project websites. So they've been doing this for years. And in many ways, they become a model for so many other aspects of the organization. So we're not starting from scratch here. And really the whole purpose of our current focus on ESJ is to formalize our commitment. And that's one of the reasons we wanted to create this policy. And again, to make sure it's applicable across the board, not just for transmission. So I mentioned earlier, we started our policy in January of last year, and we really wanted to make sure when we created that policy that we didn't do it in a vacuum. And so we leverage a lot of input from internal and external stakeholders as part of that policy creation process. So talking with our business units, talking with our operating companies. We actually have a cross-functional ESJ steering committee, which we now call our advisory team, and they represent different aspects of the business, and that was critical to get their input as we were in the process of developing the policy. You know, we did external benchmarking with various utilities and even companies outside of our industry, and we talked with community action agencies and other key stakeholders as well. So all of that really fed into and informed and led and guided the creation of that policy. So I did want to emphasize that. Again, never create your policy in a vacuum. So we launched that, again, a little over a year ago. We posted it internally. It's also external on AEP.com. As I mentioned earlier, since that time, I've been socializing the policy across the footprint just to make sure people understand, first of all, what ESJ is and how we define it, but also the trends that we're seeing, how it's coming up, you know, in the business, and what those next steps are. And so I hinted at this earlier, but we're really at that point where, again, it's that juncture in our journey where we're trying to operationalize it. And that's going to be critical because it's great to have a policy in place, but you have to give people the tools, right, to live it out and to implement it on a day-to-day basis. And so I'm in the process of working on a framework to help operationalize that policy. And we're starting with company-wide, so AEP-wide guidance and training and tools, and we're going to follow that up with a very business unit, team-specific, so customized guidance, training, and tools. So in many ways, we're kind of a tour guide for employees, if you will. We started with this broader policy. Now we're getting into this broader guidance and this more business unit specific guidance to help bring the organization along. And I would say, you know, our ultimate goal is to make sure employees have the tools they need to think about and consider ESJ in the work they do. So it goes back to the 3 Ps I mentioned before. We want to embed ESJ into our practices, our processes, and our paradigm. Our practices, processes, and our paradigm. You know, we would love to get to the point where this is baked into our DNA and it's muscle memory. And so just a couple of lessons that I've learned throughout the process is start with why, right? That value proposition is so critical. So as I'm going through the road shows, that's one of the first things I mention. Why are we doing this work, right? People have to understand why it's so critical to our business. And so it's been a great opportunity to talk about just the ESJ trends we're seeing in the federal and state space and at those levels. And to talk about the fact that investors and prospective employees, so many other key stakeholders are really focusing on ESJ and they're very interested in the work that we're doing in this space. And I always go back to the heart, right? I mean, ESJ is being a good human. I often say it's, you know, being a brother's keeper or a sister's keeper, right? It goes back to the golden rule and treating people and communities the way that we want to be treated. And so I think articulating that value proposition from the onset is so critical to the process. So that's one of the big lessons I've learned. Another big lesson learned, so one of my favorite phrases, but teamwork makes the dream work, right? And so we can't do this in a vacuum. And that's one of the reasons why when we were creating this policy, we pulled so many brains to the table to create this, even as we're going through the process of operationalizing the policy. I'm not doing it alone. We have our steering committee or advisory team working on this. I have a small internal working group putting their hands at the table to work on this. We have communications involved, we have change management. So we really have to make sure we're leveraging the collective wisdom of the team so we can compensate for each other's blind spots. And the other big lesson I'll end on is, this is a culture shift, and I know I talked with some of you last night, but this is not going to happen overnight, right? It's a paradigm shift, and it's going to take time to get there. And so I think we have to manage those expectations early in the journey and realize, again, one of my favorite metaphors is Rome wasn't built in a day, right? And so brick by brick, we're going to keep building, we're going to get there, but we have to be patient because this is a big journey, and we have to really soak up and really celebrate each milestone along the way. So a very exciting time for AEP and to be at this juncture that we are in the journey, for sure.
Great, thank you. And Conrad, I wanted to float that question to you, and I know you probably can't comment on the transmission siting NOPR from December that included an environmental justice public engagement plan, but that's probably being followed by people in the room. But I'm curious how you think about actually baking environmental justice and equity into commission actions and decisions and project reviews and concrete commission actions.
Sure. So as it turns out, I can comment on.
You can.
On the plan.
I'm shocked.
I can't tell you what is good and what is bad.
Okay.
I can't tell you,
All right. Well,
how I feel about certain comments, but I think maybe some context is helpful for the people that haven't read the proposed rule. What's in the proposed rule regarding the environmental justice public participation plan is that it requires applicants to publicize and develop a plan to do certain things, like describe the outreach that has been completed, summarize the comments that they've received from EJ communities, to describe planned outreach, to describe how they're going to take into account language assistance for linguistically isolated populations and non-English speakers, and then finally to describe how they plan to engage environmental justice communities about mitigation. And I think that's a big piece. I wanted to circle back to the discussion about engaging communities and community benefits, plans and programs. I think one of the lessons learned from the roundtable, which is on YouTube, and if you ever get, if you have some time to watch it, it's very interesting and very worthwhile, is that these are very complex issues. I mean, communities, we say the word community like it's one community and it's one thing. It's not. It's a very complex picture of facts. The regulatory picture is moving very quickly. The science is moving very quickly. And it requires flexibility. It requires thoughtfulness. Like YaVonda said, it requires an all-hands-on-deck approach. I'm sure every company here has a community engagement shop. Is that group connected with every single partner that might be impacted or might be useful to this picture on this front? Maybe, maybe not. So I think that being thoughtful, being considerate, following up, being transparent is one of the goals of this plan. It's one of the things we heard from the roundtable, and it's very important to kind of move the ball and let communities know that their voice matters, which is going to improve, the NEPA process is going to improve legal durability. It will be a useful and worthwhile thing to do. I will say, and I have to plug, I literally have to plug the NOPR. The comment period is still open, so we are reading your comments. We will take them into account. They're important to kind of help guide us as to what the final rule will be. So I think I'll end it there.
but you can't say what is good or bad about it.
I cannot say what is good or bad.
Okay, just to clarify. So, we've talked a lot about the public outreach and participation, and that's really interesting. There's been some discussion, too, about actually providing resources and funding for interveners in these cases. So, and that came up during the Environmental Justice Roundtable, I believe. And I want to just start with you to get your take on, is that something FERC is looking at, providing intervener funding with the idea that a lot of these communities don't have access to law firms or the same type of resources that project applicants do? What are your thoughts on that? Is that a direction that you would?
Sure. So it is something I can comment on. The Office of Public Participation was created in 2021, along with my position. And part of its mandate, in addition to generally increasing access to the Commission's processes, is there's a federal mandate to coordinate assistance available to interveners and participants. And what that looks like and what that is isn't set yet. It could be a rulemaking. So I don't have more to say in terms of exactly what is taking place. I know they're working very hard on those issues. And to also plug OPP, they're going to be a great partner going forward to help communities engage, to engage with applicants. So you'll see a lot more of them in the future, and they're developing a lot of great tools, and they're gearing up for this year and in the future. So.
Tiffany, would you want to talk about that and just maybe the challenges that communities or local groups would face or a landowner would face in participating in these projects, and how important is that intervener funding element?
I would say that it's really important. As someone who has been on both sides, I've worked or volunteered on my county's Environmental Justice Commission. So I've been that person, the member of the community. And then I'm at a law firm that clearly, has to represent the companies in this space. So I think having funding for interveners is really important because essentially it's bullying if you can't defend yourself in this space. So being able to support that is ideal and important, and I know there are some great organizations who do that pro bono type of work and are able to support communities who can't support themselves. But more of that is always welcome, and I think it's fair given the entities that they're up against. You guys are huge in some sense, and it's only fair. Outside of that, though, I do think that just supporting engagement financially at the forefront is also helpful to even avoid having to have that intervener process. If the federal government provides funding to you all or to developers, to companies, to pay for a community engagement, which is very expensive, and I know it is, and no one's mentioned that, and everyone says just do it, but it's very expensive to do proper and meaningful engagement. So also supporting that financially would help not even have to use interveners, not even get to this conflict space if it's paid for, it's quality engagement up front.
Wanda, would you want to add to that a little bit, just from the project applicant and developer's perspective? Like, how do you, as you're implementing this plan, do you see a need for communities that may disagree with the developer and may want to see changes to a project? How do you think about that?
Yeah, definitely recognize the validity of the question, and I would just say funding may definitely be a part of the solution, but I would really encourage all of us to take a step back and think bigger and think more broadly. And again, it goes back to what can you do in the beginning of the process from the onset. I often say we want to make sure ESJ is a forethought, not an afterthought, right? And so are there certain tools that we can use to really ensure that meaningful engagement early on? I mentioned everything from project websites to virtual open houses to in-person open houses to mailings. Are there some steps we can take, some tools that we can use in the toolkit to really prevent that from becoming even an issue down the road? And even, as Conrad mentioned, the OPP and taking advantage of those kinds of resources. So I would, again, encourage us to think more broadly and think bigger about, again, what are some things we can do from the onset to address those issues early on.
And just to circle back on the company's plan and the work that you've been doing, did you, for the people in the room that may want to pursue something like this, did you look at, did you draw from certain resources, or did you look at other companies or trade associations on what they would recommend?
We absolutely did. So we actually did interviews with several other utilities that already had policies in place. We had a chance to look at their physical policies as well, because we wanted to make sure we weren't starting from scratch and reinventing the wheel. And so getting a look at some of their lessons learned, some of their best practices was really critical as we were informing our own policy. So that's one thing I would really encourage. Learn from each other, right? We're all in this together. I've heard so many people say, everyone's building the planes, they fly together. And so let's share best practices and share knowledge, so we're not doing it in a vacuum. So absolutely, that was a critical part of our process.
Well, as we expected, the hour is flying by. I have a few more questions, but then maybe we can open it up to people in the room. And really just wanted to ask about, your advice, kind of building off what you just said. And Tiffany, maybe you can share, your advice for project developers looking to get more into this space. How do you, what would you recommend for them to, have a legally durable environmental justice policy and plan, to be able to also speed development, because as the acting chairman just said, that's a top priority at FERC and across the country. So what would be your advice for, both speeding development of transition while also, implementing an environmental justice plan?
So I would say first and foremost, be proactive about implementing your environmental justice plan. So, you're already ahead of the risk that could come. The companies who are kind of trying to figure it out on the fly after they get sued and after the project is stalled, you kind of losing a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of energy, no pun intended, on not having prepared yourself. So when you're creating that environmental justice plan and ingraining it in what you do, outside of it being the right thing to do, and you're protecting human lives here, think of it as we're protecting our business as well. We're protecting ourselves from the legal risk, from the financial risk, from the reputational risk. Cancel culture is real. It's not just legal risk. Of course you can get sued, but if someone gets on Twitter and calls you out, that's just as bad for business as well. So starting early and often on putting these plans together, socializing it, just like YaVonda has been talking about, making it clear that this is ingrained within our company, this is what we do, this is what we plan to do, using the resources that are already out there to create this plan. In my previous role, I worked for the Georgetown Climate Center. We put together an entire free toolkit on equitable climate resilience tools and ideas and community engagement plan opportunities, what you should do, examples, case studies. I mean, there's so much information that's out there already existing that you can pull from to create your plan that'll really get you started. So, I mean, being proactive about it will put you ahead of so many of these other companies and will save you a lot of time, again, save you a lot of money. Because stalling a project, we all know how much that costs just, because you have some sort of legal, stopgap. So, of course, including in that engagement plan, quality, meaningful engagement, two-way engagement, accountability measures within that engagement to show that, you're actually implementing some of the ideas that you're hearing from the community, different options for how you're engaging, not just, an online virtual meeting, but having several in-person meetings, meeting the community where they are, hosting them at different times, maybe providing lunch, dinner, so that folks are not missing out on anything when they're coming to spend their time and provide you their expertise on the issues that they're dealing with. It's also treating the community as a valued partner, just like you would treat a vendor. This is your partner in this project, and you have to take their consideration into your implementation plan. So the earlier you do that, the easier it is for you to implement their suggestions in your process and in your planning process. Again, all of these tips and tidbits they're out there, they're already existing on the internet. There's someone who's done it in the industry already, I'm sure, that you can pull from. There are great companies at different levels, like Los Angeles Department of Power and Water does the LA 100, and then they're doing an equity strategies. Like that's free information that will be out there that you can pull from, and I highly suggest to not reinvent the wheel unless you're feeling frisky. But there are great ideas out there that can be implemented and help you get across the finish line.
If I can follow up, I think it's part of the reason why the environmental justice public participation plan is in the backstop citing NOPR and is in the form that it's in. One of the lessons from the roundtable, obviously that was after the rules proposed, but communities want to be involved and they want to be heard. And what that looks like can differ, but at bottom it's, you don't want to go to some place, speak out into a void, and then get handed back something down from on high. I mean, and feel like you had no input. That's why, doing things like summarizing comments can be helpful. You also don't want to you don't understand sometimes the ins and outs of the science and the regulations. It can be helpful to explain, how you got to a certain decision, what options you discussed and decided weren't available, kind of what input you valued and what your objectives are. And I think communities want to be involved in that process to understand what's going on what's going on and understand what's impacting them and why. And I think that's at the foundation of NEPA. It's at the foundation of environmental justice. It's meaningful access, not just access, meaningful access in a way that is culturally appropriate, in a way that can further people's understanding of what's going on and helping them feel like they have an impact in what's going on.
Great, thank you. Well, let's go to questions from the audience. anybody has one.
I'll go ahead and get us started on this, but thank you for sharing your insights on these issues. And what I was curious about was whether you think there are any differences either in approach that companies should take or in the issues that companies might face between a greenfield project, which is brand new and going through an area that hasn't been developed before, and a brownfield project, which is, replacing some existing infrastructure, but might be able to use existing rights of way or things like that. Are there any real differences either in what the issues might be or the approaches companies should take in those situations?
I don't think there's much of a difference in approach. I just talked at length about how it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, but fundamentally, meaningful engagement is meaningful engagement. I think there's probably a difference in emphasis in the potential for there to be impacts that need to be assessed and impacts that need to be discussed with the communities to get their input on what they've been going through and kind of what their issues are and what their potential mitigation looks like. So I don't see a difference in process. It's more a difference in substance.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. I mean, I always say outreach, your strategy has to fit the projects, right? And it's really case by case, but to Conrad's point, I mean, the same tools that we use on a greenfield project, we use on a brownfield project. And so at the end of the day, you just have to make sure that you're using the tools that make sense to ensure that meaningful engagement, regardless of the type of project. It's still critical. The impact might be a little bit different.
And I agree with both of them, but at the same time, it's, again, it's the same process, but it's a different consideration because likely the project that's existing is brownfield is likely near an environmental justice community given history, given facts. It's usually near one. So thinking of what they're already dealing with as far as cumulative impacts is something that you really need to think about when working in a project that's existing. What else are they dealing with? It might have nothing to do with your project, nothing to do with transmission, but it might be the breaking point, like another construction project on top of the power plant that's next door, on top of the asthma rates that are killing our children. Just considering what people are already going through is a bigger deal when it's a reuse project.
And that's why it's so important, again, meaningful involvement. We
Yeah.
can't make assumptions. We have to make sure that we're talking with those communities
Absolutely.
and getting those perspectives and not making those decisions in a vacuum.
Yeah, so quick question. So for you, YaVonda, as the utility owner up there, so we're a builder, right? We build large-scale transmission for a lot of investor-owned utilities. We do for AEP. On the actual construction side of ESG, when the project is being under construction, we have to do a lot of outreach. We are in upstate New York right now with a big project we're doing. What could we do as a company? What can my team do as a company to help, with ESG and what you all have been sharing here today?
I think that's a great point, and I think kind of just taking a step back, I mentioned ESG touches so many parts of the business, and that's why we want to make sure that everybody who's involved, even contractors, consultants, that they're all up to speed on our policy and really how ESG ties into their day-to-day work. I think that's a wonderful question, and I think really one of the best ways I can answer that is, again, be thinking about the community, right? It goes back to meaningful involvement. I think a lot of times people think about meaningful involvement at the onset of a project, but even in the construction phase, you still want to make sure we're constantly talking to communities. I think about our transmission project team, and they're always sending out postcards, letters, communications, just to provide those ongoing project updates and considering, the community's inconveniences and concerns even through the construction phases of the process. So it doesn't stop just in the planning phase, even as you're going through execution, thinking about those communities and engaging with them and considering those impacts at every step of the way.
And I'd like to piggyback off of that as far as getting creative on the co-benefits of your projects. You as a construction team ordering breakfast from the local bakery, regularly is a co-benefit to having this project existing in their community. You're still feeding into this community in a positive way while, doing the work that you need to do. There are ways that you can be a positive force in certain communities based on what their needs are and what are existing there. You know, ordering all of your coffee from here versus Starbucks. I mean, there are small things that you could do that would leave a positive impact on that community.
Hey, David Kelly with Southwest Power Pool. Thanks for all your comments. It's been enlightening for me. You all talked a lot about the actions of ESJ and making sure that there's a lot of outreach and the right voices are heard. What are the outcomes, though, and how can utilities and industry measure whether or not we're actually getting to where ESJ is supposed to get us to? Do you have any thoughts around that? Rather than just the actions, what are the outcomes that we should strive for, and how do you measure that?
I'd love to start with community benefit agreements. Having that written down on paper is we engage the community, here's what they asked for, here's what we asked for, and here's what we have come to agree to. Having that on paper will pacify everyone, all parties, and it shows that you did your due diligence. They agree with what's about to happen. Of course, that might change if, you know, something drastic changes. It could change, but just having that on paper is really important. It's legally enforceable. It's evidence that, you know, you did the right thing. So I highly encourage agreements between you and community members.
Yeah. I can add, I think, to build on the, you know, the EJ public participation plan and things like it. She talked about legal durability. I mean, that is one of the outcomes. Showing your work, you know, showing people that you've done a reasonable process and an adequate process is something that increases legal durability of your projects, and that's, you know, that's a value add in and of itself. You know, community benefits agreements, mitigation, those are other outcomes that need to be tracked, in my opinion, and messaged appropriately, because the message and what actually happened can be different. So it's something that I think is important.
And I will say from our perspective, we've definitely seen a growing focus on metrics, especially when it comes to community benefits plans, right? And you think about the section of the CBP that talks about Justice 40, and what are some of those policy objectives that the project we're pursuing is going to support. So whether it's resilience, whether it's job creation, entrepreneurship, supplier diversity. And so I think in a way for our organizations, it's been really good conditioning, because I think going forward, we're going to have to be thinking about metrics and how do we measure our performance. And as we're going through this ESJ implementation phase of our journey, that's one of the things that's on my radar. You know, not just tracking developments in the space, but again, tracking our performance. What metrics do we use so we can maintain that ongoing governance and accountability and guidance around documentation and disclosure. So we're going to be tackling all of that with that next phase of work, but that metrics piece is going to be critical, because it's hard to know the success you're experiencing or the progress you're making if you don't have a baseline and a way to measure that, for sure.
Hi, Bill White with Bureau Veritas North America. Great panel, just like everybody else said, really tremendous to hear all the perspectives. It's related to the question that Mr. Kelly just asked, that you, on metrics. So, you know, we've seen the commission moving in the direction of a more balanced assessment of benefits and costs as we look at transmission decisions, and, you know, bringing in a lot of other values that haven't traditionally been considered in making decisions, rather than, you know, what I would consider a myopic focus on first costs and really looking at benefits. And is this where, you know, specifically with ESJ, is there, you know, and I think, Vonda, you were talking a little bit about that, but just a little more on, you know, how does this fit into the broader discussion of benefits and costs as we evaluate transmission decisions, whether it's on a planning basis or on individual projects?
Absolutely, and I often say we've seen this evolution, right? For so long, ESJ was all about mitigation, right? Mitigating those disproportionate negative impacts. And now the conversation has really shifted more to maximizing positives, maximizing benefits. And we're seeing that with Justice 40, huge benefit or huge focus on advancing benefits for disadvantaged communities. And so I think that's something for us to really be paying close attention to. And not just maximizing benefits, but maximizing people's understanding of the benefits. So it goes back to what Larry mentioned earlier. You know, are we really telling that story about the value and benefits of transmission investment? You know, when you have those landowners who are understanding or who are not understanding, why are you building this area or this transmission line in my area? Can we really articulate all the range of benefits that they're actually getting from that line, whether it's safety, whether it's reliability and resilience, clean energy economy, efficient markets. In economics, we talked about that quite a bit. A lot of times people don't think about the jobs that are created because of transmission projects. They're not thinking about state and local income taxes that are generated, labor income, all the other economic activities that are stimulated in an area. So again, what are we doing to really articulate that story? So not just maximizing those benefits, but making sure people truly understand those benefits and telling that story as much as we can. I think that's going to be critical, and especially if you have a long-range power line where a person doesn't necessarily see those direct benefits. Can we go indirect? Can we really, again, articulate jobs, taxes, those direct benefits to those communities, and do that in a way that's as granular as possible? So do the in-plan analysis, do the economic analysis activity you need to do to provide that very specific, project-specific data, because at the end of the day, people want to know what's in it for me, right? I always use the acronym WIFM, what's in it for me? And so as much as we can share that granular data around those benefits, the better.
And to piggyback off of that, I encourage folks to bring in resource partners. If you don't feel like you can articulate the benefits to the community in the way that they would understand, bring in a community engagement consultant, someone based in the community who has that relationship. Pay them, please, and pay them well, because they're providing a service to you, and they can communicate what you need in the way that they can be received. I encourage that all the time, because I understand this can be like a hard conversation to have when a community is already kind of against the project. So hiring someone who they trust, who has no pick in the fight, it's just, this is what they do. And they're always helpful in getting the message across.
So I interpreted your question a little bit differently to kind of be about the public interest determination for siting and permitting. I want to be careful because I certainly can't speak for the chairman or the commission in terms of what that public interest determination will look like. Frankly, there haven't been that many orders. Or I'm looking at Karen, and Karen's gone. I don't know if there are any orders with that public interest determination. But I will say that the chairman's been pretty clear that environmental impacts, environmental justice impacts are part of his public interest determination in other contexts, and that picture is still developing. But if you can read the NOPR, read the tone of the NOPR, you can see environmental justice, resource reports, tribal resource reports, environmental justice, public participation plans. You get a sense of the importance that that information will play going forward.
I have a question just to build on comments that was made earlier regarding how do you know you're getting measurable outcomes for the input that's needed in the project? And you all talked about engagement through community action agencies, and I'm sure it's like the Urban League and those different areas that sit in the urban communities. I'm curious, how do you know that you've checked all the boxes? Because I remember, years ago when you would do town hall forums, everyone's not going to show up, right? And everyone is not going to be at the Urban League or the action agency. So what alternatives do you look at more creatively? And I'm speaking particularly in the urban areas where grandma is at the church. So are you all looking for those, or do you all have those as alternatives to make sure that you've done everything that you could do? Because what I think I understand, at the end of the day, when these projects are being developed, they're taking place specifically with a utility who are looking to rate base, they're going to be asked, what are, those things that you did to engage? And I'm just curious if that's one of the alternatives. If you don't have the measurable outcomes in the areas that you look at, what alternatives do you look to be inclusive in areas that you may not have reached before?
I would say, again, just being creative about meeting the community where they are. It's not just the open town hall that you're going to get the entire community to show up to just to give you their opinion for free. Again, there has to be some sort of incentive and benefit to the community to even care to participate in your engagement processes. So meeting them where they are, doing the meetings in person, doing them virtually, doing them at church, doing them at school, doing them at night, some during the day, having daycare, having dinner, having breakfast, just making sure there are several opportunities that shows that you created a meaningful intent to engage the entire community. Again, there's no number, there's no, I guess, metric for that, but I think it would be clear that, you know, instead of hosting 2 random town halls versus I hosted 6 meetings at different times throughout the day, at different locations throughout the community, it shows that you were intending to actually reach a full, you know, range of the community. Outside of that, reaching actual leaders and existing groups within the community to spread the word. Sometimes you don't even have to do the work, they'll do it for you. As far as telling, you know, everyone about what's going on, they already have a wide reach. Being the head preacher of the biggest church in the community, or the principal of the biggest high school in the community. So using the leaders that are existing to make sure you get the reach, or at least try to get the reach. Of course, you're not always going to reach everyone, but it's all about the intent and showing that you did your due diligence.
Yeah, Tiffany hit the nail on the head, right? It really comes down to, I love the phrase she used, meeting people where they are. Right, and we've had projects where we pulled out all the stops. So whether it's project websites, virtual open houses, in-person open houses, we've actually had mailings where we've done everything from postcards to trifolds with tear-off comment cards. And we've had situations where we've provided very detailed packets in the mails, especially for landowners in rural communities, where they actually had a copy of a map with their property on the map where they could circle it and provide feedback to our project team. We've included comment cards and self-addressed stamped envelopes, so making it as easy as possible for people to engage. And to Tiffany's point, thinking about the timing of meetings. You know, can you even use grocery store bulletin boards to post information about a project? You know, I think going bilingual is so critical. I was talking to our siting and outreach leaders last week or so, and they had a great example of a project in Texas in the Rio Grande Valley, and it was a lot of work, but they translated all materials for that project into Spanish. So news releases, materials mailed to landowners, materials at their open houses. You know, they had translators actually at the open house. They actually have their transmission website, aaptransmission.com, where literally at the click of a button, if you push the Spanish button, it translates the entire website in Spanish or the language of your choice, as long as it falls under the Google Translate umbrella. So taking advantage of those opportunities to meet people where they are is critical. Using HOAs, schools, libraries, having multiple open houses, whether it's at the beginning stages of a project or multiple times throughout the project, so people have multiple opportunities to have input. You know, we've had small group meetings with landowners or individual meetings as needed, door hangers for rental properties, right? So the list is endless. So, and it requires work. I always say ESJ is hard work. You know, it really is an investment of time and effort, but if you want to show equity and meet people where they are and give them what they need, which is what equity is all about, you have to be willing to leverage as many tools as possible in the toolkit. And that goes back to what you're talking about.
If I could add, I agree with everything you guys just said. I want to shamelessly plug the Office of Public Participation. You know, when the siting starts to take place and the permitting starts to take place in the corridors, I think they will be a great resource because they'll be very active within the communities. They're non-decisional, so they'll be active throughout the entire process. You know, pre-application, application, and you know they're very tied into a lot of these communities. A lot of the advocate groups, and I think they'll be an important resource going forward.
Well, we're already at the
think
top of
we're
the
over
hour.
time.
I want to thank our panelists and our moderator for your comments, your insights, and your suggestions on how to address some of these issues. So everyone, please join me in thanking our panel and moderator.